Hi everyone, my name is Nicollette. I am a Master of Social Work student at the University of Toronto, currently completing my practicum with First Safer Space. Today I will be sharing information about anti-Indigenous racism and how it affects our institutions and as well as Indigenous communities. Although this PowerPoint presentation will not encompass all there is to know regarding this very important social justice issue, it is a starting point about beginning thought and reflection on how we can address this in a very intentional way. For me, let's go. Anti-Indigenous racism is the ongoing race-based discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice experienced by Indigenous peoples within Canada and around the world. It includes ideas and practices that establish, maintain, and perpetuate power imbalances, systemic barriers, and inequitable outcomes that stem from the legacy of colonial practices and policies. Systemic anti-Indigenous racism is evident in discriminatory federal policies such as the Indian Act and residential school systems. It is also shown in the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the provincial criminal justice system, as well as the child welfare systems, and the inequitable outcomes in education, well being, health, and overall care for of each of these communities. Individual lived experiences of anti Indigenous racism can be seen in the rise in acts of hostility and violence directed at Indigenous communities as a whole. To understand the origins of racism inflicted upon Indigenous communities, it is fundamental to examine the colonialization of Aboriginal land. Canada was founded through colonization, through which European political power exerted control over Indigenous communities' land and claimed ownership over their domains. Colonizers used ideologies of race as a justification for the endless exploitation of Indigenous communities who were deemed as quote unquote inferior and quote unquote savages, needing to be controlled and turned into a civilized population. For Indigenous peoples, this meant being forced to leave their lands, break apart their communities, and dismantle their culture to assimilate into mainstream Canadian life. Subjected to the unquestionable power of European colonizers, Indigenous communities were victimized and continue to be victimized through the need to define Indigenous communities as the other and or as peoples in need of being controlled and civilized in Canadian society even today. The displacement of Indigenous peoples from their land was first validated under the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery, whereby European colonizers were permitted to claim ownership over the land if non Christians inhabited the space, and therefore was considering the land free to be taken. This was the case when the Europeans first arrived at the Turtle Island, known as today as North America, and claimed ownership of Indigenous land. Prior to the doctrine, it is fundamental to note that Indigenous peoples had their own governance practices, as well as treaties with other Indigenous nations to share the land while maintaining a sacred relationship with Mother Earth. Despite the doctrine ruling that European colonizers could presume the land was available for the taking, Indigenous peoples have inherent rights to Canadian land because these lands were inherited from their ancestors throughout generational lines with specific meanings and philosophies, worldviews, and laws applicable to specific Indigenous life. Of course, a presumption that this land was free to be taken if not occupied under the mandates of European Christian colonizers is racist in and itself. This racism and violence has continued through the 1876 Indian Act, residential school systems, institutional racism in healthcare, and present day institutions today. There are a number of negative stereotypes associated with Indigenous people, including assumptions about the pervasiveness and cause of alcohol and drug addiction, unemployment, and violence. One persistent and particularly damaging depiction is that Indigenous people are willing wars with the state, depending on others, and ultimately better off when the federal government oversees their affairs. This is not only degrading to the autonomy of the Indigenous people and their legitimate right to self governance and self determinacy, but it has damaged the self concept of countless generations of people who, unfortunately, at times have internalized these damaging stereotypes. The media plays a considerable role in shaping public perceptions of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and although contemporary representations are more accurate and inclusive of these communities, they are still often corrupted, misinformed, and present ideologies of tokenism and lack historical and cultural context. As a whole, Indigenous peoples do in fact experience racism in Canada through the victimization of European colonialism, the 1876 Indian Act, as well as the Canadian residential schools. However, these are a few in a plethora of instances through which Canada's assertion of being multicultural, diverse, and colorblind is in direct contestation with their actions. Despite this pretense, Indigenous communities are a prime example of how racial discrimination continues to occur within Canada, despite the unfounded belief that racism does not exist within Canadian borders. These issues persist, and in the same manner that Indigenous communities continue to exist in spite of efforts to remove and destroy them, or more casually, ignore and singularly pathologize them. Understanding how the Canadian government has allowed these disparities to occur over time in the past and continuously in the present is fundamental to understanding how Black, Asian, and Indigenous communities and all other communities that are seen as oppressed and facing these vulnerable circumstances can continue to experience the systemic racism within Canada. As a world, and especially as a society, we must acknowledge the existence of racism and develop strategies for countering the harmful effects of racism in our institution as well as our everyday ideologies. All existing policies and practices must be reviewed to ensure that racism is not being perpetuated. This work requires development of anti-racism policies and strategies, as well as anti-racism training for all who work in the social service industry, as well as professionals that generally deal with people and Indigenous populations for tailored practice. This could include knowledge and learning aspects of colonial history, such as Indian residential schools and Indian hospitals, timeline of historical events, and context for understanding social disparities and inequalities, examining culture, stereotyping, and the consequences and legacies of colonialization, and introducing new tools for developing more effective communication and relationship building between different communities. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it was helpful, and take care.